that we think are important for you to reflect on when you assess this thing called decentralization. Because we're all from different countries, different jurisdictions, different systems of politics, of administration, different administrative cultures, and different history. So the issue of decentralization and how it works within your country will differ from how it works in your neighbors or your colleagues' jurisdiction. South Africa has a different system from Zambia. Zambia has a different system from Kenya. Kenya has a different system from Ghana. We are all different, but there are really some very fundamental questions that we can all agree on that are important, and it will help us to get sort of a language going for the next 2 weeks that helps us to learn from one another. Because when we talk about decentralization, there are all these terms, all these words: delegation, decentralization, deconcentration, federalism, cities, regional government, provincial governments. These things obviously get bandied about if we talk across jurisdictions, and sometimes it gets a bit overwhelming because there is no standard, no universal rule. There's no international benchmark that determines how decentralization must work in each and every country, because countries make their own decisions, as they should, about how to structure the state and what is the role, responsibility, and status of, let's say, subnational governments. So what I want to do with you in the next hour is to unpack that and just agree on a number of questions, and I have 8 questions. 8 questions, at least for me, that help me to understand how to understand a particular country's approach to decentralization. And I think tomorrow, when we listen to Dr. J.B. Boax, you'll get some similar, probably slightly overlapping observations, maybe different questions, and out of that you will extrapolate your own understanding and your own approach to how must I understand decentralization, particularly when I talk to other people from other jurisdictions, because that's really what we want to get going in this African School on Decentralization. We want to invite you, encourage you to not be locked into your own system, but compare, contrast, learn from other jurisdictions, learn from your colleagues. And what are some of the questions that we then run into? So there's 8. Is local government protected by law? Is there local democracy? Do local governments have power? Do local governments have access to finances? That's of course the big theme for the next 2 weeks. We'll delve into that with much more detail. Do local governments control their own bureaucracies? How do senior governments supervise local governments? What happens when things go wrong? Is there recourse when the rules are broken? And is there a framework and practice of cooperation? I want to unpack each and every one of those 8 questions very briefly, and if we have time, I don't know if we will get to that in time, I want to ask you to discuss some of these questions with your neighbor as part of this morning's session. But let's start with the first one. And granted, the Dalla Omar Institute is located in the Faculty of Law, so we will always have a little bit of a legal bent. We are lawyers, most of us are constitutional lawyers, so we look at decentralization primarily through the lens of the institutions, the laws, the regulations, with, of course, a lot of attention also to finances, politics, administration. But you have to forgive me that my particular observations, there's going to be some legal bent to it. And probably tomorrow, Dr. J.B. Boax will take a much more economics-oriented interpretation of similar questions. And that's great. We're not going to just have singular views and singular approaches here, but look for commonalities across the various disciplines. So the first question that I always have when I look at a system of decentralization or a system that professes to be decentralized, one of the questions I would ask is there some sort of protection for local or regional government, whatever you call it in your country? What does the law say? Is there protection? Is there protection, and where is that? Where do you find that protection? Is it in the Constitution? Does the Constitution say anything about that subnational government? Increasingly, constitutions on the African continent do, but there are also quite a few constitutions that are almost silent on local or regional government. So that's already an indication of the level and the seriousness of decentralization. Maybe it is in a special law. In some of our legal traditions, we don't have it in South Africa, but in other legal traditions, particularly those that are more civil law traditions, for example, with history with the Portuguese or with the French, you have special laws with a special status that are not as senior as the Constitution, but that are nevertheless, for example, adopted by Parliament with a special majority. So they give special status, special protection to those laws. Sometimes local government is protected and regulated in that special law. And in many cases, local government would be regulated and protected, its powers, its functions, its finances, in an ordinary law, which could be an act of Parliament, could also be regulations, whatever kind of system your country has. So that's one question. And then there's two sub-questions there as far as I'm concerned. Is there what kind of reference is there in the law to subnational government? Is it just a general recognition of the existence of local government? Does it go only as far as that? For example, where the Constitution of Lesotho, for example, makes one or two references to local government, says there must be a local government, but it leaves all the detail to Parliament to regulate in acts of Parliament. Or is there more specific protection for the institutions of local government? The governance and the boundaries. For example, is there some sort of protection in the law against the national government dismissing a mayor, even though he or she may be elected by the voters in that municipality? Or another question could be, is there some sort of protection in the Constitution or in special law or ordinary law for the boundaries of local authorities? Who can decide whether or not new boundaries must be drawn, that 2 or 3 or more local authorities must be merged, or that a local authority is abolished? Well, we don't want to have a local authority in this area. We don't need local government in this area. All those kinds of questions, some of them may resonate with you and others may not. But think about the question, is there some sort of protection in the law to safeguard local government against arbitrary decisions by the national government with respect to local government? So that's one question. And if you reflect on this in terms of your own jurisdiction, I'm sure you can come up with some examples. Second question, is there local democracy? And this is quite a fundamental feature of decentralization. It comes with the notion that you have a subnational government led by politicians. Ultimately, they take political accountability. How do they end up in those positions? Are they elected? If so, how? Are they elected by the voters in that local or regional area? Or are they perhaps elected via the national system? Or perhaps are they appointed? And we have different examples of this across the continent. Here in South Africa, all councillors are elected by the voters in their jurisdiction. But we also have countries on the continent where some or all of the councillors are appointed by the central government. For example, if I'm not mistaken, and you must correct me if I'm wrong, I think a portion of councillors in Ghana are not elected by the voters in that municipality, but are designated by the national government. And that's an example of how different countries deal differently with that question. And there's nothing inherently right or wrong about choosing one or the other system, but it does tell you something about how committed is that country or that system to decentralization. Because the argument is true, genuine decentralization does come with local democracy, locally elected political leadership, and perhaps not with a leadership that is appointed by the center. Second element to that question is, it's all good and well to have elections written into your law, that every 4 or 5 or 8, whatever years, there will be local elections. This is the electoral body that will run those elections, and these are the rules for the elections. But sometimes that exists in law, but not in practice, because local elections are simply not held. And again, we have had examples of that in the past. If I'm not mistaken, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, in Malawi, there had been a very long period in which there were no local government elections. That is now changed, and now there are regular local government elections. But for a long time, for whatever political reason, which we don't need to get into, local elections were postponed, not held for long periods of time. At the moment, I think if I'm looking at Professor Zemelak, local government elections in Ethiopia are not being held, even though the law is quite clear that there shall be regular local elections in Ethiopia. For reasons that have to do with the instability and political difficulties in that country, there have not been local elections, and it's uncertain as to whether that will take place. So the difference between having provision for regular, free and fair elections in the law and actually having them in practice is, unfortunately, on the African continent, something that's not always the same. I saw your hand up.
I wanted to ask, in terms of regular, what is the proper time frame? Is it a year?
Yeah, so there's no international rule or no. With regular, one would mean you have a system, a legal framework that says we're going to elect new, fresh councillors every 4 years, every 5 years. Maybe there are systems that do it every 3 years, but I haven't heard much of that. So I would say the norm would be 4 or 5 years. But of course, you can have different systems. You can also have systems whereby a portion of the council is elected according to a certain cycle, and another portion according to another cycle. That's also possible. So there's no international or firm universal rule on it must be so many years, as long as it's regular, with the idea being that fosters accountability, that your term as a political leader is finite. It comes to an end. And at the end of that term, you or your party have to go back to the campaigning to make sure you are re-elected. And that's part of the accountability that elections bring with it. So that will be my answer.
Thanks, Prof. Just a question of clarity. Within the South African system, the first local government elections we had was 1996. Thereafter, after every 5 years. Now that we have our brothers and sisters from fellow African countries, is there any country that has both national, provincial, and local government as one pole, or are they different? Maybe just a view from other countries. Thank you.
So now we're going to enter into a dialogue, which is fantastic. But let's keep it short so that we can also, after that, have another Q&A. But maybe some examples of, does your elections run all on the same day? Because in South Africa, it's national, provincial on a particular day and local on another day. I know in Zimbabwe, it's all on one day, so there's already one example. Do we have more examples from either of the two? Very good.
Yeah, in Malawi we have tripartite elections. We do presidential, parliamentary, and local government on the same day.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
In Tanzania it's different. The local election are preceding the general election. So this year we have general election. Last year we did the local election. However, the councillors are being elected during general election. And there's been a debate why is the case.
So there's a debate here in South Africa as well about should we move to one day? Should we have everything in one day? We've always, from our point of view as the Institute and the way we look at it, we've always argued against it. We said it's better for local democracy, it's better to achieve this particular, let's call it benchmark, if your elections are not on the same day. And we can have different views and different opinions on that, but our reasoning is if your local elections, where you go to the voting booth to cast your ballot for mayor or councillor or party, in our view, on your mind should be local issues, kind of issues that the mayor spoke about this morning, those kind of issues. On your mind should not be which political party has the right policy on foreign policy, or which political party do I feel this deep philosophical allegiance with, regardless of how good or bad it performs locally. In our view, when your local elections are on the same day as all the other elections, the issue of who becomes the next president will overshadow and crowd out the local issues. Nobody cares about what does this particular candidate mayor want with the future of roads in my city, because on my mind is I want him or her to be the president and not the other person. That's one of the arguments that we have separated out so that you can really have local elections about local issues. But you know, there are different views and different approaches on that.
Just a question. Just a question.
Yes.
I'm looking at these elections being done alternatively in 2 days. Who funds these elections? Do the local governments fund and then the general election funded by the government? Because then I'm looking at the resources and we're always talking about limited resources and how successful. And then how do you then ensure that at the general elections, the people who went to vote for the local government elections are coming? Because it's like you're taking so much of their time again.
True, so those would be arguments against, you know, the cost issue. Doing it all in one day probably would save money. Counter argument could be, you know, the cost of democracy. If you want to really promote democracy, you got to put your money where your mouth is. So accept those higher costs, but you know, it's an argument that one can have. And you know, the voter turnout can also be something that you obviously everyone, or not everyone, most people that want to go and turn up for the presidential elections, and in the slipstream of that, you ask them also cast your vote for the local elections. That's an argument. One of the other arguments that we also entertain here in South Africa is if you would collapse all the elections that we have in one day, national, provincial, and local, most voters will have to cast 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ballots. One for national, one for provincial, and 3 for local government elections. 1 for the district, and 2 for your local municipality. That also at some point starts triggering the question, how much of an informed vote is that going to be? Look, you and I will be able to understand exactly which ballot is for what. But someone who is not into politics, but who is a voter who needs to cast his or her vote, now I've got 5 ballots and they're all long and I don't know which one is which. Is that still an informed vote? Are we not overcomplicating the electoral system by putting all those ballots on one day? Again, an argument that one can agree or disagree with. So this issue of local democracy is important because it defines the extent, and helps define the extent to which the system is committed to local democracy. There's lots of other questions that come with it, as we just discussed. Then the third one is, okay, the issue of power, or functions, or responsibilities, however you want to call it. What does the system say about what the subnational governments, whether they are local governments, or regional governments, or counties, or provinces, what are they going to do? What are they responsible for? And are those powers, can you find them somewhere? Are they somewhere in the law? And if so, where? Again, is it in a constitution? Is it in a special law, if you have those kinds of special laws? Or is it in an ordinary law? And of course, the higher up you find the powers, the more protection they have. In Kenya, powers of the counties are listed in the constitution. South Africa, the powers of local government are listed in the constitution. In many other countries on the continent, the constitution may say local governments must do things, but exactly what they do, we're going to leave to Parliament, which then can, of course, be amended more easily than a constitution. So the higher up the powers are identified, the more protection those powers have. That's why the mayor could this morning speak quite confidently, say, well, we're actually quite blessed here in South Africa. We have a constitution that recognizes our responsibilities and even our revenue-raising powers. And that is something that was a choice that the drafters of the South African Constitution have made, and in different other countries, different choices were made. So it's an important question about where those powers are identified and protected, but also how. Are they specified? Is it quite clear what those powers are? And are they substantial? Are they relevant? Or does the law say that, you know, local authorities, you can deal with dog licenses and beer halls and that kind of stuff, which is not really the big ticket issues with which you can make meaningful change in your society? Or does your law or constitution say, no, local government is responsible for major services such as water, electricity, roads, public transport? How does your country, your jurisdiction do when it comes to affording local governments meaningful responsibilities with which local leaders can really effect meaningful change? And again, different choices would have been made in different jurisdictions across the continent. So the one issue is, what are the powers, where are they, and how specific and relevant are they? But also, what type of power does the local authority have, or the regional authority? Is it only the authority or the responsibility to implement and execute? Or does the local government also have the authority and the discretion to make policies and to have a say in how powers are exercised? For example, if you have to charge certain tariffs for certain services, do you have the authority to determine what tariff and how you levy that tariff and how you collect it and how you make distinctions between various groups in your municipality? Or do you simply get an instruction from the central government, this is the number, this is your tariff, and you have no discretion at all? So that's also a question that you can ask. Can local governments adopt their own policies and local laws to give policy direction for that specific function or power? And lastly, who decides the budget, the local budget? Here in South Africa, Mayor Gordon Hill-Lewis would every year table a budget in the Council of the City of Cape Town, goes through a whole series of consultations and procedures. Ultimately, it is the Municipal Council that adopts the budget. The National Treasury peers over the shoulder of the mayor and has all kinds of things to say on that budget, and also gets opportunities to make those inputs, but the National Treasury doesn't approve the City Council budget. It is the City Council that approves the budget. And here again, we also have different practices across the continent. It's quite common still that local government budgets need to be sent to the national government for some sort of approval or endorsement before the budget is legally valid. And that is something, you can have different views on that. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is that maybe a good example of supervision and cooperation where the national government works together with the local government to make sure the budget makes sense and is compliant? Or is it an example of centralization where the national government tries to dictate through that approval power what the budget of the local authority is going to say, which may go against the wishes of the local citizens, the residents? That's another debate that one can have. So it's an important marker in your assessment of how does decentralization feature in my country. Right, let's go to number 4. This is then the big one, why we're here for the next 2 weeks, access to finance. And this is the most rudimentary reflection on it. You will go into much more depth over the next 2 weeks on these issues, but of course also, as the Mayor indicated this morning, decentralization of responsibilities, sure, but what about the money? How are we going to fund those expenditure responsibilities? And the Mayor was saying that in South Africa, metropolitan municipalities are quite blessed with significant own revenue authority. So that's an important question. What does your system say? Your laws, perhaps even your constitution, the parliamentary legislation, the regulations, what does it say about to what extent can local authorities raise their own revenue? Very often in the form of property and land taxation. That's still one of the most common forms of taxation at local level, and we'll have a whole session, a day session devoted to that next week. But also charging fees for services. If the local authority is responsible for delivering certain services, can it charge for that? Can it keep the revenue? Can it decide the level of those tariffs, for example? Also, can it keep the revenue, as I indicated? Because we also have some systems where municipalities, local authorities are responsible for collecting revenue, but once they've collected it, they must hand it over to the national government, and then they get it back, hopefully in some form of grant. Those are also systems that we have. Of course, one would not want to condemn those systems as being bad, but it does say something about how committed are you to decentralization. Yes.
Thank you. For the previous one, the issue of powers of local government and finance, access to finance, I think these are good ideas, but I was wondering now about the issue of capacity, the capacity of local governments. Don't you think that these local governments should be empowered enough really to be able to do that? Thank you.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it comes back in the next slide. So, of course, these are sort of issues that if you look at them in isolation, you're going to miss the bigger picture, because obviously a lot of our local authorities may not have the capacity to implement, to have their own taxation system, because it's a big deal to run your own taxation system, to run your own property evaluations, to decide on tariffs. You and I know both that that's an immensely complicated task. Deciding on tariffs, collecting fees, you need capacity for that. So certainly that comes with the discussion on this, that you cannot have the one without the other. This also applies to the second bullet point. Are they allowed to borrow? Is that something that is part of the thinking? Even if not now, maybe in future, are local authorities permitted to raise capital, and if so, under what conditions, and what is the role of the national government in that? It's also an important marker in assessing the level of decentralization. And then thirdly, there will always be a mismatch between what local governments are responsible for and what they can raise in terms of own revenue. Even in South Africa, with arguably a system that gives quite a, let's say, liberal power to local governments to raise their own revenue, even in South Africa, there is still insufficient funding in that to do everything that the local government is supposed to do. Certainly when it comes to capital investment. You cannot expect a city like the city of Cape Town to invest in infrastructure completely based on what it taxes citizens and what it charges for services. So there will always be a mismatch. And that mismatch then brings in the issue of what is the assistance from the national government? Does the national government assist the sub-national government with a share of national revenue? Because in most of our systems, I would argue in all of our systems, the national government is the wealthiest, has the most powerful taxes, and collects the most money. In most of our countries, you can't even compare the amount of money that the national government collects through taxation and other sources and local governments. So that's where the real big bucks sits in the national government. So what is the share that the local government receives out of that, and how does that share come? The question was from Collins, does it come conditional? Does it come unconditional? The mayor spoke about formulas and how he's a bit unhappy with the way the formula works out for the city of Cape Town because it doesn't count all the people that have moved to the city of Cape Town off land. So that whole basket of issues we will delve into over the next few days, and is an important marker of the commitment to decentralization of that country. What is the share of national revenue of local government and how is it calculated? It's a very complex but very important area of law and economics. Good question.
Maybe a question, Prof, to also add in the discussion is how does transition happen from, especially for countries now who are starting their decentralization, because our case in Kenya is that, and it's something that the civil society we are concerned with, is for example, the national government was handling, for example, health services sustainably. Then when it's transferred to counties, the resources do not follow the functions. Then we begin to judge counties with the little resources, so there is the percentage that is protected in the constitution, certain percentage, and I know you, in the program we are going to delve into it. But that's very small compared to what services they are expected to render. So what is the, which approach of transition? Because ideally our thinking is that if we are transferring health, all the monies that we're handling, doctors, medicine, should follow that. Yeah? So there is a problem with the transition from the legal perspective into the financial.
And maybe to add on to that is the case of the Nairobi City County, which transferred some of its functions back to the national government. At that time, we wondered, how are we transferring these functions? What is coming back to you, to the national government? Remember, in our constitution, it provides for 15% of recently audited accounts. Now, if 15% of that has been transferred to this county, and now this county has transferred some functions, back to the national government, how do we do the maths there? Because they're still, and these employees who are doing that particular job, are they now national government employees? That's the question. And so we did actually a proposal in the Senate. Of course, it died in the National Assembly. They could not understand that. So the question is, how do you cost these functions? Because then the question of costing comes from, what are the factors? What is the criteria? What do you cost of these functions? And then secondly, when you transfer the functions, as you said, what goes and what remains?
this is for the counties. Now, what happens when you do the reverse? Because our constitution allows for the county, which will not be able to deal with that matter, to transfer it back to the national government. What happens there? Thank you.
If I had the answer, I could make lots of money as an international consultant. I don't have the answer. A quick response, and then I'm going to respond quickly.
Maybe it's just a follow-up, Prof, to check in a case that a county in any of the countries that we are referring to, that it's not able to carry out its function, either due to capacity or any administrative deficiency, what is the intervention of the central government? Within the South African system, I think we have section 139, where if a municipality cannot render services or there's issues of maladministration, the constitution allows for the section of 139 to be invoked, where either provincial or national government can take over. So maybe in other countries, how does it work? Thank you.
We're going to come to that issue as well of supervision as an important feature of decentralization. There was quite a few questions on Kenya, and I'm not an expert on Kenya. So we've got Dr. Gichana, who's the expert on intergovernmental fiscal relations in Kenya, so I'm sure he's going to answer all your questions. I want to make one comment though. When you talk about the share of national revenue, of course, you very quickly arrive at the question of how do you cost it? How do you cost it? Big, sort of, almost insurmountable question in all systems of decentralization and devolution. How do you put a cost to a certain function so that you can design the right intergovernmental fiscal grant or fiscal mechanism? We'll talk more about it, so don't worry. We'll have Dr. Jamie Boax, we'll have Dr. Tanya Ajam, and they're all specialists in intergovernmental fiscal relations, know about this much more than I do. I do want to make one observation, is that one thing that I've learned over the years of my involvement is that you cannot cost a function. You cannot. You cannot cost a function. And I always explain that with a very silly example. Let's say the function that you want to cost.
Let's use health.
Let's take a silly one. Let's take the function that you want to cost is space travel. Because national governments may have an interest in space travel. You've got NASA in the US, various countries have various space travel programs. They want to send people to satellites and to move into the orbit. That's a function. How much does that cost? It's impossible to cost it. Depends how often you send astronauts into space and what you want to do there. It's potentially infinite amounts of money that you need to do that function. You can't just, on the basis of the function, put a cost to it. But what you can cost is standards, minimum standards. Okay, I want to do space travel, that's a function, I think it's important, so I'm costing it. But the standard is I want to send one mission of 3 astronauts once a year to do a mission of 20 days. That's the standard. Now that you can put a cost to. I hope I'm making sense. So the same would apply to health. As a function, you can't really cost it. But once you start formulating minimum standards of what that particular service should comply with, that becomes more possible to cost. That's the one lesson that I've learned over there. We can't continue the conversation, but let's reserve the rest for later. But just keep that in the back of your head, that costing a function is very difficult, but costing the standards in terms of which you deliver that function becomes a whole lot more manageable. Right, so clearly this is a big issue. The share of national revenue and how that is decided. One quick point on that is, the mayor was saying this morning he doesn't really disagrees with the way the formula works out in South Africa. And I think that's great, because the mayor will raise that. Whenever he has the opportunity, in intergovernmental meetings, he will raise that issue of, listen, the formula is not working out the way it should for us. and these are the reasons. These are my facts. These are my facts with which I argue against the amount that you're giving me. That's possible because we have a transparent system where everyone knows the formula, because it's published, it's in the intergovernmental fiscal relations architecture, make sure that the formula is published, the data comes from an independent statistics agency, so even when you disagree with it, you can argue about it. What's the problem in some countries that do this differently is that the amount that you receive of national revenue is essentially a lucky packet. You don't know. You just hear there's a number, Minister of Finance decides this is the number, this is what you get, and you better be grateful. Now that's not a system of transparent, fair, intergovernmental fiscal relations, because you can't argue with it. It's simply a largesse, it's benevolence, it's not a fair, equitable division of revenue. So that's an important element of that discussion of the share of national revenue, which for many, if not most of the countries around the table, is still the biggest source of revenue for local governments, as opposed to own revenue.
But on the issue of formula, on the issue of the formula, as he was complaining, is it not reviewed regularly? The formula, is it not reviewed regularly? Because what he was saying is that he thinks the formula at the moment is unfair to them because the configuration is changing. But I think the principles of these formulas, you have a time from where you have to review them, maybe 3 years or maybe 5 years. What's the case here?
So it is reviewed constantly. There's always debate about it. There's no formal instruction in the law to review it, but it's always under debate. But it hasn't changed for many, many years. So that's an important part of the discussion. How fixed is that formula? The issue, because so there's two elements. So one is a formula. What is part of the formula? But the mayor's gripe was not with the formula, actually, but more with the data that is used. And that's almost as important as a formula. And that's again something with which many of the countries around this table have challenges at how reliable, how objective is the data that is used to calculate. Because you can have a formula, that's fine, but what goes into that formula? So his argument is, a lot of people have moved to the city of Cape Town over the last couple of years, and those people are not counted. The data that is used for the formula is outdated because we cannot rely on the data that goes into the formula. So, but we'll unpack all of these issues in the sessions that will follow. The fifth question is a completely different question, and it's often, I would say, often underestimated, which has to do with the practical question of who controls the bureaucracy. Okay, we have local politicians, and if we are committed to decentralization, we want to argue those politicians should be locally elected through whatever electoral system. It doesn't matter really what kind of system, as long as there's local accountability and local democracy. But that's the politicians. But what about the bureaucrats? Who decides all of that? And then there's two questions. The one is, who decides how the structure of the administration is organized? How many departments? Which department is responsible for what? What are they called? Are they units? Are they other kinds of branches? What is the structure of the organization? Can the local government decide that itself? How it structures its administration? Or is there some sort of template that comes from the national government and says, this is your organization? You will have 4 departments. They are called community services, finance, economics, and whatever, and that's it. You must all do this. Argument could be, well, maybe there should be some discretion on the part of the local governments to decide we want to have a different kind of structure because, for example, we are a coastal city. So we are very concerned about environmental management, so we want to dedicate a whole departmental unit to that. Another local authority inland would not have that same concern. So should there not be some sort of discretion on the part of the local or regional or county government to decide how to structure their own administration? That's the one. The second one is a very simple question. Who appoints the staff? Who appoints the staff of the local authority? Is that the council? Is that the local leadership? Or is there mechanisms through which outside entities, national, provincial, or perhaps even independent entities, we often have systems around the continent where there is a public service commission of some sorts that exists separately, independently, and that makes appointments of staff and also maybe deals with disciplinary issues, suspensions, dismissals. So it's not the authority of the council itself. And this, I want to be quite emphatic here, there's no judgment on whether that is good or bad. Both systems have their pros and cons, where you have national or some sort of independent agency making staffing appointments. Here in South Africa, it's entirely the council. The council appoints a city manager, a municipal manager, and also the managers that report to him or her. It's a council decision, and all the staff in the municipality are appointed subsequently by the municipal manager, often through delegated authority. Ultimately, all personnel is appointed by the local authority. We see in South Africa a tremendous amount of problems with that. Abuse, where the autonomy, this is a kind of autonomy, is abused. People get appointed without necessary qualifications, skills, expertise to be able to do the job. So what does that mean? Does it mean we need more regulation? Does it mean maybe we need to take that appointment power and put it somewhere else? Maybe should we have provincial governments appoint municipal staff, or should we have it done by an independent entity? Those are questions that are doing the rounds now in South Africa as we try to come to grips with how this has worked out for South Africa. But in principle, the argument is still local governments should have a say in who runs the administration in that particular locality. So that's also something that you may want to reflect on. How does that work in your system? What are the pros and cons? The sixth question is this issue of supervision. It was mentioned earlier about capacity. It's all good and well to argue for own revenue and taxation and charging fees for services, but what about capacity? And this is when the issue of supervision becomes critically important and should be part of the discussion of decentralization. How do senior governments supervise local government? Is there systems of course, regulation? You need, someone must determine the laws. That's often national government that determines the laws on how local government operates. But is there systems to monitor and evaluate? Is there systems to support local governments or regional governments in developing their capacity to perform some of those functions? And if things go wrong, Thabo mentioned earlier, Section 139 of the South African Constitution provides for intervention if things go wrong. If a local or regional or provincial government really performs badly, fails to exercise its responsibilities, fails its citizens, money is stolen, services are not delivered, there's corruption, fraud, etc. Is there a mechanism in the law, perhaps even in the Constitution, that would empower or permit senior governments, national government, to correct that? And how does that work? And how do they do that? Do they issue instructions? Do they come in and take over? Do they impose laws or budgets? What are the kind of mechanisms that are in your system to correct serious problems in the subnational performance of decentralized functions? And again, the way that is being structured and practiced will tell you a lot about the degree of commitment to decentralization. Number 7, we're getting towards the end of the discussion, is, again, it's all good and well to have all these systems on paper. On paper as in, you have them in laws, you have them in policies, you perhaps have them in the constitution, some of these things, rules about how finances are divided, what powers local government has, what the procedure is for adopting a budget, who appoints staff. You can have all those rules. But what happens if the national government breaks those rules? Can the local government do anything? What can they do? Is there recourse when the rules are broken? Can, for example, local government turn to the courts when decentralization rules are broken? Think about that in your own country. Let's say the amount of money that a local authority receives is fundamentally too little. And the local government really suspects the Minister of Finance is really breaking the rules here. He's making it impossible for us to do our job. He's allocating us a pittance. We cannot perform our responsibilities with this amount of money. Can you do something? Or when the national minister or local government in your country abuses his or her authority for political ends and dismisses or dissolves the political leadership of a local authority, and everyone kind of knows it's because there is political things happening in the background. Can you take that issue somewhere? Can you take it to a court? Can you take it maybe to an independent tribunal? Is there protection for what is essentially the rule of law in the system? Important component of decentralization, because I do think many of our countries on the continent have very ambitious, perhaps even clearly articulated decentralization policies and programs and even laws, but the courts have nothing to do with it. There's no recourse. So if the rules are broken, you sort of have to live with it. Now, is that really decentralization? Because with decentralization, or rather the other way around, decentralization is difficult to implement, to make true on decentralization if there's no rule of law. Also in the rules of the game of decentralization. So that's another question that you could reflect on. How does it work in my country?
I think it's also important to ask if the recourse is effective, because we can have like drawn out processes of recourse, as we often see in South Africa, that don't have an effective outcome in terms of accountability and change in the system.
And also what one would want to avoid, and it's the last slide that I'm going to have, is on, we also don't want decentralization to be a very litigious issue. Right? I'm talking here about levels of government bickering with each other. That's essentially what this is about. You're not giving me enough money, you're not giving me enough power. Ordinary citizens are very disinterested in that. Listen, just deliver services. Don't bicker amongst yourselves as politicians. And that's legitimate. We don't want our courts to be overburdened, to be occupied with turf battles between politicians and between levels of government. So it's a balance to strike between, yes, you want recourse, you would want the rules of the game and rule of law protected, but decentralization is mostly a politically managed exercise. There's a question here.
Thank you again, Prof. In Eswatini, we're in the process of establishing a local government bill, and I'm happy to be learning. I appreciated the section 139 on capacity monitoring and evaluation, but I wanted to know, for this particular one that we're on, do we have a specific section within the South African Constitution for us to tap into and learn from? Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely in the South African Constitution, we can talk more about it maybe over the break or during the course of the next 2 weeks. There's quite a few provisions on monitoring, support, and intervention. And all three are elements of supervision. So monitoring is what kind of systems do you have to regularly check what local governments are doing. And there was a question this morning for the mayor from Namibia, do you submit accountability reports? Because there's a level of accountability that a local government has towards the center because it receives money from the center to begin with. So there's systems for regular monitoring, support, which is providing support, financial but also other types of support, and intervention, what happens when things go wrong. So in the Constitution there are very basic provisions on that in South Africa, but then in the legislation, in the Municipal Finance Management Act and in the Municipal Systems Act and a whole range of other laws, you'll find very detailed provisions on how those systems of monitoring, support, and intervention are implemented. And for me, the discussion about supervision is part and parcel of the discussion about decentralization. Other scholars may disagree and say, no, you only talk about autonomy and local democracy. The thing of supervision is like almost countering decentralization. I don't think it should be viewed like that, because you cannot really have the one without the other, because of mainly the capacity issue that was raised. So recourse when rules are broken is another important feature to look at. Then lastly, it's all good and well to talk about autonomy, about the protection of autonomy, protection of your revenue, protection of your powers, protection of your right to appoint your own bureaucrats. It's all good and well to talk about supervision, regulation, monitoring, support. But what about cooperation? What about working together? Leaving aside the issue of who does what and supervision and what goes wrong, what do we do when things go wrong, just about the day-to-day collaboration between different levels of government. And this is sort of the soft side to intergovernmental relations. It's not based on hard law, it's not based on sort of hard interactions. It's based on goodwill and based on collaboration. A number of things are important there. One is, do your local governments associate themselves? Do they group themselves together in associations? Do they have groups where they come together, where they jointly advocate for local government issues? Are there local government associations in your country? Secondly, does the national government have systems in place? And are those systems practiced, where the national government consults local governments? Well, if we are going to take a decision as a national government, we're going to pass a bill, we're going to pass a budget, or we're going to take decisions on the sharing of national revenue, we'll actually come to you. We want to hear your views, because you are ultimately the recipients, or you will benefit, or you will negatively be affected by our decisions, so we want to hear your views. Are there systems for that in your country? Maybe even regularized meetings, where every quarter all the mayors meet with the Minister of Local Government, for argument's sake. A regularized system of, we need to talk to each other. We need to be in a constant dialogue, because we're in this together. Yes, we both have our areas of authority, and there's autonomy, and there's supervision and all of that, but in the end we need to work together. Are there systems and practices for that? Do your various levels of government enter into agreements? Do they negotiate things out? Where they deal with overlapping competencies, complex projects that require the involvement of different levels of government? Is that something that happens in your jurisdiction? How does your system deal with the importance of spatial plans and budgets aligning? You cannot have a situation where each and every local authority adopts its own spatial plan and its own budget without even considering what it means for the rest of the state and for other functions and other levels of government. You need to talk about these things and try to achieve, as far as possible, joined up spatial planning and spatial budgeting. And lastly, how are disputes resolved? This issue of recourse when rules are broken, but also you just can't agree on a policy issue. What happens to it? Is there some sort of system in place where you seek alternative dispute resolution before you run to the courts? Or before the national government makes the final decision? Is there systems that take into account the need for disputes to be resolved amicably? Because disputes are inevitable. The more you decentralize, the more you allocate responsibilities away from the state, and they get exercised by subnational governments that make their own decisions, disputes will arise. It's inevitable. It's part of practicing decentralization. The real question is, what do you do with those disputes? Is it simply a matter of national government has a final say and decides? Do we run to the courts for each and every dispute? Do we blame each other in the media as politicians and engage in mudslinging and making everything uncomfortable and unpleasant? Or do we have systems in place where we seek mediation, alternative dispute resolution, to see if we can, within the system of cooperation, solve the dispute that's in front of us? So these are the 8 questions that, at least in my observation, will tell you something about your system. If you reflect on those questions, in terms of your own system, how do we do with these issues? And you'll have varying answers on the various questions, but it will tell you something about what the commitment is, how far are we in terms of implementing a decentralization reform. I wanted to leave this with you by way of introduction. You will hear many different perspectives over the next 2 weeks on some of these issues, but hopefully it gives you something to chew on and gets us more or less into the same space of dialogue on issues around decentralization. All right. Is there any burning questions? We are a little bit over time, and I think lunch is waiting for us. We had a busy, busy morning. So I would also not mind if we can close the session for now and agree to meet again this afternoon after lunch. We just double check the program. I think we are supposed to reconvene in about an hour's time. We are a little bit over time. So we are supposed to start with the mayor's session at 1 o'clock. So let's make that 1:15, just to make up a little bit on time. So you can all have your lunch in 45 minutes and be back 1:15 for our mayor's roundtable convened by the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. So thank you very much for your attention this morning, and enjoy your lunch, and see you at 1:15.